News of the Times. The Cambridge Pudding Mystery. The Suspected Poisoning of Henry Day. True Crime from 1871. Cambridge, 1871. A young labourer in Cambridge collapses within hours of eating his morning meal. Violent stomach pain, green vomiting, and rapid inflammation of the bowels point unmistakably towards poisoning. Yet, when the city's chemists examine the evidence, he finds no trace of any known poison. Days later, a second test reveals only a minute trace of arsenic, far too little to kill, but more than enough to unsettle a neighbourhood already on edge. Henry Day had been married for just 3 weeks when he returned home in agony. As neighbours rushed in, whispers began almost immediately, and when constables later uncovered a dead cat buried in the yard, rumoured to have eaten from the same meat pudding Henry carried to work that morning, the sense of unease only grew. Suspicions quickly settled upon his new wife, Charlotte Day, who found herself facing hostile crowds, relentless questioning, and a courtroom struggling to interpret wildly conflicting scientific evidence. Was Henry poisoned? Was the humble meat pie pudding to blame? Did the dead cat hold a clue, or was it simply another coincidence in a sweltering June week? In today's episode, we explore one of Cambridge's most perplexing Victorian mysteries, sudden death that baffled doctors, divided neighbours, and exposed the limits of early forensic science. Before we close, a brief diversion into a domestic puzzle that baffled not the chemists of Cambridge, but a very alarmed lady in Lambeth. No arsenic, no analysis, just the age-old question of how a respectable stonemason managed to end up in entirely the wrong bed and in absolutely no condition to explain himself. Settle in with us as we step back to Cambridge in the summer of 1871, a city of narrow lanes, busy yards, and quiet kitchens, where a simple meat pudding would spark one of the era's most bewildering inquiries. From the Cambridge Independent Press, the 24th of June 1871, suspected poisoning of a coprolite digger. A good deal of excitement prevailed in the neighbourhood of Staffordshire Street during the early part of the present week in consequence of the sudden death of a man named Day, aged about 27 years. There were some rather suspicious circumstances attending the man's death, as well as the bereaved widow, and rumour very busily put the deceased was poisoned. With Henry's death so sudden and the symptoms so severe, an inquest was convened almost immediately. The coroner and jury gathered at the Norfolk Inn. Neighbours were summoned as witnesses, and the first accounts of Henry's final hours began to take shape. What emerged in that small Cambridge pub was a mixture of alarm, confusion, and contradictory detail on that fateful day. The neighbours, many of whom had witnessed Henry's decline at close quarters, became increasingly insistent that something was amiss. Their conversations with the constable grew pointed, and more than one urged that the circumstances required firmer action. By the time the inquest opened, the sense of local suspicion was unmistakable. From the Cambridge Independent Press, the 21st of July, 1871, an inquest was opened at the Norfolk Inn in Norfolk Street on Tuesday evening before Mr. H. Gotobed, coroner, and a respectable jury, of whom Mr. Bedall was foreman, with the body of the deceased Henry Day. First came the testimony of Elijah Pink, a fossil digger who had worked alongside Henry that morning. Pink deposed that he had called for him at 4:30. Henry was in good spirits, and they walked together to the coprolite pits near Hawkston. Henry had brought a small meat pudding, bread, and cheese for breakfast. Importantly, both men drank from the same water source, and no ill effects were seen with Pink. Henry seemed perfectly well until about shortly before 8 o'clock, when, as Pink recalled, Henry suddenly stopped and said, I feel so bad, Elijah. My heart fails me. Pink persuaded him to lie down on his coat, where Henry slept uneasily until midday. When he woke, he said the pain came in waves, from his heart to his head and down into his body. Soon after, he began vomiting, what Pink described as a good deal of green stuff. Some of it contained the remains of his breakfast. Attempting to help, Pink walked him towards a nearby public house to get brandy. Henry collapsed twice on the way, each time needing to be lifted. By the time they reached the door, he was so weak he lay motionless on a wheelbarrow. Pink recalled Henry describing the sensation in his chest as going pit-pat, and said he had experienced something like it before, although never so violently. Eventually, a fossil cart passing down the town carried Henry home, and it was the last time that Pink saw him alive. Importantly, members of the jury offered that they had also drunk from the same well the same day as Henry's passing, and they had had no ill effect. Mary Ann Newman, who lived next door in Staffordshire Street, deposed next. She was one of the first neighbours to reach the house. She confirmed that Henry and Charlotte had lived there only 11 weeks and had been married just 3. When she entered the bedroom shortly before 3 o'clock, Henry was lying on the floor unresponsive, with Charlotte trying unsuccessfully to get water into his mouth. His eyes were closed, and he did not stir when Mary Ann touched his hand. I think he's going, she told Charlotte before hurrying to fetch more help. By the time she returned, Henry had died. She later remarked that his clothes and mouth were marked with mud and froth, a detail that troubled several witnesses. When the constable arrived soon after, he collected the remains of Henry's dinner, the meat pudding, bread and cheese, wrapped in a cloth. Next came the medical testimony, confirming that Henry Day had already passed by the time he arrived at the house. Edward Knowles, MRCS of 12 Newmarket Street, deposed, I am a surgeon at Cambridge. I knew the deceased, Henry Day, on Monday after 5 o'clock. The last I was called in and was sent for. I found him lying on the floor of Staffordshire Street. I found him in the passage on the floor of the bedroom. He was quite dead. The prisoner was in the room, and I was trying to restore him with his face and hanging on to her. There was some warmth between the region of the heart and the cold, clammy perspiration on the forehead, but he was dead. His face was pallid and covered with cold, clammy perspiration. There was no pulsation at the wrist or over the region of the heart. There was warmth about the heart, but the heart was dead. The extremities were cold. The whole of the face and his mouth was covered with froth. In appearance, that the whole of the abdomen was green. The neighbours had said he had vomited. It was the colour of beer. I laid him on the bed and I tried to administer brandy, but he could not swallow, and I have no doubt that he was quite dead before I reached the house. The prisoner said her husband had come into the house about 10 minutes before and complained of a violent pain in the body, vomited the fluid I saw, and then fell down and died instantly. Henry and Charlotte Day. Although little is recorded about Henry and Charlotte Day beyond the event of this case, the outline of their circumstances is clear enough. Henry was about 27 years old, working as a coprolite digger, hard physical labour that meant leaving home before dawn and relying on whatever food could be wrapped in a cloth for the day's work. Charlotte was around 38, kept the small household in Staffordshire Street, a street of tightly packed cottages where sounds travelled easily and neighbours paid close attention to comings and goings. They had lived together for only 11 weeks and had been married just 3 when Henry collapsed and died in a community where little went unnoticed. The sudden death of a young man newly wed to an older wife stirred both sympathy and suspicion, and as rumours began to circulate, the case quickly drew the attention of doctors, magistrates, and more than a few curious neighbours. Money was tight in the Day's household, and behind the closed doors of number 50 there had been recent tension over the rent, a landlord's threat to seize their feather bed that led to a sharp exchange between the husband and wife, overheard by more than one neighbour. In a close-packed street, when news travelled quickly, such quarrels rarely went unnoticed, and they coloured the way the community interpreted Henry's sudden death. Although not explored in detail during the hearings, there were murmurs in court about an earlier bereavement in Charlotte's past. The prosecution attempted to introduce it as supporting evidence, but the defence objected immediately, and the magistrate ruled that it had no bearing on Henry's death. The matter was dropped, but the very mention of it added to the unease that already surrounded the case. With the neighbours' accounts given, the inquiry turned to the medical evidence. At the coroner's instruction, Mr. Knowles conducted a full post-mortem examination, and his findings only deepened the concern surrounding Henry's death. Mr. Knowles conducted a full post-mortem the following morning. He found no external injuries, but internally the picture was striking. The lungs and large vessels were heavily congested, and the stomach and intestines were swollen with gas and marked by a vivid, patchy inflammation that ran the entire length of the alimentary canal. The liver, kidneys, and pancreas showed similar congestion. Henry had vomited a considerable quantity before death, a mixture of beer, meat, cheese, vegetables, and mucus, all of which the doctor preserved for analysis. Taken together, Knowles said the symptoms and the condition of the organs was exactly what one would expect from an irritant poison, and he could not account for such rapid and extensive inflammation by natural causes alone. In his view, Henry had died from acute inflammation of the bowels. The coroner then called the next witness, Mrs. Elizabeth Meek, who lived beside the Days and had been present at the house shortly after the doctor's visit. Her evidence focused on the remains of Henry's breakfast and where it had been kept. Another neighbour arrived at the house shortly after the doctor had left. She saw Henry laid out on the bed and Charlotte bringing forward the remains of the food he had eaten that morning. Meek remarked that some might accuse Charlotte of starving her husband, but the presence of the pudding, bread, and cheese showed otherwise. What caught Meek's attention was what happened next. Charlotte wrapped the food and placed it in a drawer where she apparently kept other household items. Meek later retrieved the bundle herself and handed it to the constables for their inquest. She noted that there was butter in the drawer but no other pudding, and that she had not previously seen this one opened. Small boy, Charlotte's son, even reached for a piece of it, prompting Meek to warn Charlotte not to cut it, saying it might be needed. The exchange only added to the growing sense that every scrap of food in the house had now become evidence. The last testimony of the day came from William Burke, a hawker who lodged in the same house. He saw Henry around 12:30, walking slowly and clearly unwell. Henry accepted a drink of beer, but could barely manage more than a mouthful, his hand shaking as he held the cup. He told Burke the pain had first struck him at work that morning. About half an hour later, Charlotte came to Burke's room, saying she believed poor Henry is dying. Burke's wife sent for the doctor. Charlotte, he said, seemed too distressed to move and said nothing about fetching medical help herself. With the household evidence now before them, the coroner brought the day's proceedings to a close. The stomach, its contents, and the remains of the pudding were ordered to be analysed, and the inquest adjourned until the results could be obtained. In the meantime, Charlotte Day was placed on remand on suspicion, the authorities unwilling to rule out foul play until the chemical tests had been completed. From the Cambridge Independent Press, the 24th of June 1871. Charlotte Day, 38, wife of the deceased, a woman rather under the average height, thin and somewhat determined looking, was apprehended on a warrant on Wednesday, charged with wilfully causing the death of her husband by poisoning. She was taken before Elliot Smith, Esquire, at the police office and remained till Monday. On Wednesday morning she was brought up before the mayor and continued in the box during her examination, as there was no intent to commit. She appeared with the same sullen position in which she found herself. At last, with the post-mortem complete and the contents of the stomach and pudding examined, the inquest reconvened. The court was noticeably fuller than before, and the first evidence called was the most anticipated of all, the results of the chemical analysis. From the Cambridge Independent Press, the 1st of July 1871, suspected poisoning of a coprolite digger. The adjourned inquest was held on Monday evening at the Norfolk Inn before H. Gotobed, Esquire, and the jury. George Downing Lively, Professor of Chemistry to the University, deposed, "I have had much practical experience in chemical analysis, and part of my duty as professor is giving instructions in it." Professor Living went on to tell the inquest that he had examined the remains of Henry's breakfast, the meat pudding, bread, and cheese, along with the vomit preserved by the doctor. Despite testing both the food and the fluid, he found no trace of any mineral or crystallized poison, no arsenic, no oxalic acid, no corrosive subliminate, and no phosphorus. The stomach, he said, was virtually empty when he received it, and although he made a preliminary inspection, he considered a full examination unnecessary at that stage. In his view, a poison had been present in the pudding. It ought to have appeared in the vomit, which contained visible fragments of the meal. Living told the jury he knew of no common irritant capable of producing Henry's symptoms that would not be detectable by analysis. The results, he said, pointed firmly to the absence of any known mineral poison. The coroner, clearly troubled by the gulf between the medical and chemical evidence, now recalled Mr. Knowles. The surgeon had been unequivocal that Henry's symptoms and the condition of the organs pointed to irritant poisoning, yet Professor Liveling had found no trace of any such substance. To address this discrepancy, the coroner brought Knowles forward to further question. From the Cambridge Independent Press, the 1st of July, 1871, suspected poisoning of a coprolite digger. On being recalled, Mr. Knowles reiterated that the entire alimentary canal from stomach to rectum showed marked inflammation. In his view, the symptoms were exactly those produced by an irritant poison, most typically a mineral poison or oxalic acid. Vegetable irritants, such as aconite, could cause similar effects, but would usually produce a stronger narcotic symptoms, which were absent here. He dismissed strychnine and other rapidly acting poisons, noting that Henry's decline did not match their characteristic signs. What struck him most was the speed of the illness. In more than his 30 years of practice, he had never seen inflammation of the bowels progress to death so quickly from natural causes. Knowles added that the case reminded him of a widely reported instance in which several people were poisoned after eating turkey, although that matter was never fully resolved. He told the jury he would not expect to find a poison in the intestines if it could not also be found and detected in the pudding or the vomit, where it ought to have appeared. Until further questioning, Mr. Knowles noted that the few poisons difficult to detect by chemistry were unusually obvious from their symptoms, and no such symptoms had appeared in Henry's case. He confirmed that he had personally delivered all the material evidence to Professor Liveling: the remains of the meat pudding, the bread, the cheese, the packet of Epsom salts, the papers with crystalline matter, the vomit, the stomach and intestines, and even the dead cat recovered from the yard. The coroner explained to the jury that several additional witnesses were in attendance, including the man who had helped bring Henry home and two neighbours who could speak to an earlier quarrel between husband and wife. Their evidence, he said, would have been relevant only if poisoning had been indicated, and in light of the chemical analysis, he did not propose to call them unless the jury wished, and the jury declined. Addressing the court, the coroner acknowledged that when the inquest had first opened, the case had appeared highly suspicious. The symptoms were violent, difficult to attribute to natural causes, and strongly supported Mr. Knowles' belief that an irritant poison might be involved. He added that two independent medical men that he had consulted agreed the symptoms were troubling. But he concluded Professor Liveling's analysis had disproved the theory of poisoning, and any discussion of how poison might have been administered was therefore irrelevant. With that, it would be for the jury to decide whether they would prefer to find a verdict at once or which they would only find that death was produced by inflammation of the bowels, but how caused there was no evidence to show, or if they wished, he would adjourn the case for the time. The matter would go before the magistrates on the following day, and they would take the course which they deemed best. He did not himself see any necessity for an adjournment. The jury almost immediately returned a verdict that the deceased died from inflammation of the bowels, but how caused there was no evidence to show. Although the inquest jury had determined that Henry died from inflammation of the bowels, it could not say how that inflammation had been caused. Matters were further complicated by a subsequent chemical test, which revealed a minute trace of arsenic, far too little to explain the symptoms, yet enough to revive speculation about the manner of Henry's death. With these uncertainties unresolved, Charlotte remained on remand and was brought before the magistrates the following day, while the case was considered further. The Cambridge Independent Press, the 1st of July, 1871, suspected poisoning of a coprolite digger. On Tuesday morning, Charlotte Day, the wife of the above deceased, was brought before the mayor and 6 other magistrates at the Guildhall on remand on the charge of feloniously and with malice and aforethought murdering her husband on Monday, June the 19th. The court was again densely crowded. Every part of the court in which the public were allowed was filled, and numbers congregated outside. The accused presented an anxious deportment, but manifested, whilst in the dock, no outward surprise at the result, but, as may be expected, showed much natural alacrity in stepping out on being bowed and leaving the court. Superintendent Turrell said the prisoner had been apprehended in the consequence of the evidence before the coroner's inquest of the previous week. He had attended the adjourned inquest last night, at which Professor Living, in reporting the result of the analysis, stated that he had not discovered any poison or any trace of it. With no chemical evidence to support the theory of poisoning, Charlotte Day was temporarily released, despite the deeply suspicious nature of Henry's illness. Yet concerns lingered and additional tests were ordered. Their results would soon draw Charlotte back into the court once again. From the Cambridge Chronicle and Journal, the 15th of July, 1871, the poisoning case. Charlotte Day, charged with the murder of her husband Henry Day, labourer of Staffordshire Street, by administering poison, was again placed in the dock. The court was crowded. It will be remembered that in consequence of great dissatisfaction having been expressed at the result of the late inquiry, an order for the examination of the body was obtained from the Home Secretary. The order was carried into effect on Saturday morning, and the contents of the stomach immediately sent to Dr. Leatherby for further analysation. On the same day, Professor Living analysed the portion of the meat pudding, the remains of the deceased's breakfast, upon the result of which the wife, Charlotte Day, was again apprehended. The town clerk appeared to prosecute. He said that by direction of the bench, Professor Living, with Professor Humbray and Dr. Paget, had made a further examination, and the result of that examination would be laid before them. George Downing Living, Professor of Chemistry in this university, said, "On Wednesday, June the 21st, I received some meat pudding a part of another pudding, and other matters from Mr. Knowles. I made an analysis of the meat pudding for the coroner's inquest, and up to that time I found nothing. On Saturday I made a further analysis of another part of the pudding, and in that portion I found arsenic. Sensation. In reply to the bench as to whether she wished to ask any questions of the witness, the prisoner said, "I never put anything into the pudding but a little water and pepper and salt. I'm innocent." Mr. Bowles, don't make a statement. Ask the witness any questions you like. Prisoner, turning to the professor, "You didn't find anything in the pudding, did you?" Witness said, "I've stated what I found." Prisoner said, "I'm innocent as a baby." The town clerk then applied for a remand until Tuesday, the 18th of July. The remand was granted. Prisoner was then removed, still protesting her innocence. From the Cambridge Chronicle and Journal, the 29th of July, 1871. Poisoning case at Cambridge. At the Borough Police Court on Wednesday last, before the Mayor and a full bench of magistrates, Charlotte Day was again placed in the dock on the charge of killing her husband, Henry Day, by administering poison. The court was densely crowded, and the great interest was evinced in this extraordinary case. Professor Living, summoned back from Penzance for the renewed inquiry, explained that although his first analysis of the pudding had shown nothing, a second examination on the 8th of July revealed a distinct trace of arsenic in a small portion he still had in his mortar. He reported this immediately to the mayor and town clerk. He noted that he had not re-examined the bulk of the pudding, as it had already passed into police custody, but insisted that the trace he detected was unmistakable, obtained using Reich's test, which produced a characteristically arsenic deposit on copper. Under vigorous cross-examination from Mr. Adcock, Living maintained that he was certain arsenic was present in or upon the pudding, although in extremely small quantity. He added that poison would not necessarily be evenly distributed through such mixture. He also described examining scrapings from the mortar, which gave confirmation, but extremely faint results, and the two small portions of the stomach where he detected a slight discoloration of the copper, but nothing on which he could positively swear. His position remained that the first analysis showed no poison, but the later testing produced evidence of a minute trace of arsenic. As the arsenic findings were laid before the magistrates, the court became increasingly heated. Professor Living confirmed that under cross-examination that the arsenic detected in the pudding was only a minute trace, and that he could not swear to poison being present in the stomach. Even so, the bench decided the case must continue. Mr. Adcock, defending Charlotte Day, reacted with unusual force. He protested that it was a cruel thing to keep a woman in custody on such uncertain evidence, and clashed repeatedly with the prosecution over the handling of expert witnesses. When it emerged that the eminent analyst Dr. Leatherby had found no poison in his examination, Adcock demanded that his report be read into the record, accusing the prosecution of withholding exculpatory evidence. Mr. Brown admitted Leatherby had found nothing, but refused to call him, prompting Adcock to retort that he was being asked to prosecute my own client. The exchanges continued when the magistrates reassembled on Monday. The courtroom was once again packed, Professor Liveling defending the integrity of his methods and admitting the trace of arsenic would have been more convincing had he been able to test the bulk of the pudding or the cloth in which it was boiled. The prosecution argued that the public had misunderstood their earlier statements and that they were withdrawing the case. With further hindsight, they decided that they would not be withdrawing the case. Adcock for the defence, however, pushed hard for dismissal, arguing that the matter had already been effectively adjudicated when Charlotte was previously discharged. The magistrates rejected this, ruling that she had been released only for lack of evidence at the time, and that the present proceedings must continue. From the Cambridge Chronicle and Journal, the 12th of August 1871, the extraordinary poisoning case and dismissal of the prisoner. At the Borough Police Court on Tuesday, before Mayor C. Bowles, Mr. Brown, D. Adams, and C. Lesturgeon, Esquires, and Professor Living, the woman Charlotte Day was again placed in the dock on the charge of killing her husband, Henry Day, a coprolite digger. The court, as on previous occasions, was densely crowded. Mr. Horace Brown conducted the prosecution. Much of the evidence presented initially simply repeated what had already been heard at the inquest. Elijah Pink again described Henry's sudden illness at the coprolite works. The cart driver, Robert Dew, confirmed how weak Henry had been on the journey home, and Joseph Johnson spoke of seeing him walking slowly through Staffordshire Street shortly before his collapse. Elizabeth Meek also restated her account of the food kept in the drawer, the child reaching for the pudding, and Charlotte's distress in the house. None of this added anything materially new to the case, and the magistrates noted that the facts already established remain unchanged. Further witnesses spoke only to domestic matters. A horse dealer, James Pink, recalled a quarrel between Henry and Charlotte in a public house the day before the illness, when Charlotte accused him of selling their feather bed to meet the rent. The exchange grew heated, and Henry appeared a little cross, with a fresh scratch on his ear. Another man, George Holmes, confirmed the dispute. These incidents added little to medical or chemical questions before the court, but as they illustrated the financial strain and tension within the household in the days leading up to Henry's death. As the prosecution began to realize how little remained of their case, they made a final attempt at implied guilt by the introduction of evidence regarding the death of a man from Charlotte's past, hoping to suggest a pattern. Mr. Adcock objected at once, arguing that such evidence was irrelevant and unfair. What followed was a sharp legal exchange in which the defence fought vigorously to keep the matter out of court and largely succeeded. Henry Freeman, parish constable, continued his evidence. I remember the death of Henry Spaxman, a member of Caroline Day's former household. Mr. Adcock, I object. This is a most improper question, and it's irrelevant. The clerk said Mr. Adcock might hear the evidence and then object. Examination continued. He, Spaxman, is not alive. He died some time ago. Mr. Brown was about to ask if he died suddenly when Mr. Adcock objected again. He said it was irregular and ought not to go forth to the public. After some cross-firing between the legal gentlemen, the point was overruled and the case proceeded. As the hearing moved into its final stages, the court became a stage for two competing forces: public suspicion on one side and increasingly fragile scientific evidence on the other. Dr. Leatherby's formal report was read out, confirming that no poison could be detected in any of the materials sent to him, a finding that directly contradicted the minute trace of arsenic identified by Professor Liveling. Yet the prosecution tried to salvage momentum. As Sellerman claimed he had overheard Charlotte threatening her husband a week before his death, although the remark was vague and Henry himself seemed untroubled by it. Mrs. Swan, a long-standing acquaintance, described Charlotte as generally kind. With public emotions running high, the bench turned back to the medical men. Mr. Knowles stood firm. The symptoms and the severe inflammation he observed were consistent with arsenic poisoning and could not be explained by indigestion or heart disease, yet under cross-examination he conceded what the defence had pressed all along, that without poison in the stomach, vomit or pudding, the case could not be sustained. Professor Liveling then delivered the decisive scientific blow. The arsenic he found was so exceedingly minute that it could not have caused harm, and in his professional opinion was likely accidental contamination. He added that such a quantity could have been taken with perfect impunity. Even the mayor pressed him on whether the trace might have entered the mixture by accident, and Liveling acknowledged that it lay within the bounds of possibility. At this point, the prosecution case rested on a handful of ambiguous remarks: a trace contaminant too small to poison anyone, and symptoms that could not be tied to any confirmed toxic substance. The defence, meanwhile, had successfully highlighted every inconsistency, every procedural weakness, and every scientific doubt. From the Cambridge Chronicle and Journal, the 12th of August, 1871. The extraordinary poisoning case and dismissal of the prisoner. The bench consulted for a few minutes, and then the mayor, addressing the prisoner, said the inquiry had been a very protracted one, but that was in order that justice should be done to you and the public. Some of the evidence was strong, and part of that evidence had been cleared away, and part of it has not. It is much better to think that your husband died from natural causes than by your hand. Our duty is now to discharge you, but you must understand that you may be again apprehended if further evidence is forthcoming. The prisoner was then discharged. She left the court attended by a large and curious mob. Henry Day's death left Cambridge unsettled. The symptoms pointed one way, the chemistry another, and the law, caught somewhere between the two, could not bridge the gap. What emerged most clearly from these proceedings was not a hidden crime, but the limitations of Victorian forensic science, its early promise, its blind spots, and its inability to offer certainty where the evidence could spot plainly. Charlotte Day walked free, yet not unmarked. Public suspicion had hardened long before the magistrates gave their ruling, and no official dismissal could be fully silencing the rumours that gathered around her name. The inflammation seen at post-mortem would always suggest poison. For others, the absence of any demonstrable toxin closed the matter entirely. Even the experts disagreed, their testimony revealing as much about the era's scientific anxieties as about the case itself. And then there is the humble meat pudding, a dish made in an ordinary Cambridge kitchen on a warm June morning, now preserved only through the pages of the local press. Whether it contained a trace contaminant, a natural irritant, or simply food turned rancid in the summer heat, we cannot now know. What we can say is that no verdict could be reached on evidence so slender. There is, too, the possibility of a more prosaic cause, one that Victorian households knew all too well. The meat pudding had been made from leftover mutton kept in a drawer during a spell of warm June weather in a home without refrigeration. Food spoiled quickly, and cases of violent illness from putrid meat was not unknown. Mr. Knowles himself referred to the notorious turkey case in which several people were poisoned by tainted poultry, although even he admitted he had never seen symptoms progress quite so rapidly. Henry, a young labourer working long hours in the heat and with a family history of heart disease, may simply have been overwhelmed by a perfect storm of bad food and physical strain. In the end, the magistrates were left with the only conclusion they could reasonably make: a death from violent inflammation of the bowels, but no proof of how it arose. A tragedy, certainly, but not one that the courts of 1871 could label as murder. We may never know what truly caused Henry Day's sudden collapse, but his case offers us a revealing glimpse into a world where early forensic science was still finding its feet, where neighbourhood tensions shaped public opinion, and where a single trace of arsenic could tilt the whole machinery of justice into motion. A mystery then, and a mystery remains. Further particulars, and now for a mystery of a rather different flavour, one in which no poison was detected, but the wrong man was most certainly found in the wrong bed. Victorian policing, it seems, occasionally involved less forensic science and rather more startled housewives. From the Illustrated Police News, the 20th of May, 1871. A strange bedfellow. At Southwark Police Court, William Bowl, 29, stonemason, resided with his wife in Lambeth, was charged with being on the premises of Mr. Daniels, printer, for an unlawful purpose. The wife of the latter, an elderly female, said she retired to bed a little before 12 on Saturday night, leaving her husband at work. At about 3 o'clock she awoke and smelt burning paper, and on turning round she saw a man in bed alongside of her. She thought it was her husband, but she didn't disturb him, but at once got up and proceeded downstairs to see if the gas and anything else was safe in the house. On returning upstairs with a light, she perceived the prisoner in her bed. He had his coat on, and believing it was her husband, she roused him and asked him to undress himself, when she, to her horror, found it was not her husband. She screamed out, and one of the lodgers came down and pulled the prisoner out of bed, and it was found that her husband had fallen asleep in the workshop over at his work. A constable was called in, and the prisoner was given into custody. The prisoner was a perfect stranger to her, and had no right in the house. In answer to Mr. Benson, witness said that the street door was left on the latch, and that the other doors were locked and bolted. In the prisoner's pocket was found a latchkey which fitted their lock. The prisoner appeared to be the worse for liquor, and she did not think he intended to steal anything or do anything of an unlawful act. Professor Thomas, the well-known athlete, said he and his wife lodged in the upper part of the house, retired to rest at about 12, and having gone through exercise, he was very tired, and he soon got into a comfortable sleep, from which he was aroused at 3 a.m. by Mrs. Daniels calling out, "There's a man in my bed." He partly dressed himself, went down and entered the landlady's bedroom, where he saw the prisoner lying on the bed on his face. He turned him round, and seeing it was not Mr. Daniels, he pulled him off the bed and called the prosecutor. In answer to the charge, the prisoner said he was a journeyman stonemason and worked at the new post office in St. Martin's-le-Grand. He drank a great deal on Saturday afternoon and had not the least knowledge of entering the house. The prisoner's wife, a respectable-looking female, here steps forward and said the latchkey found on him belonged to their door, and she gave it to her husband on Saturday afternoon. He was then the worse for liquor. Mr. Benson observed that it was a very extraordinary case. The prisoner lived in Lambeth, 2 miles away, and was found in bed with the wife, with the latchkey, and unlocked the door. On Wednesday, Constable Daniels said he had made inquiries about the prisoner and found him to be a very respectable working man. He believed the prisoner was in the habit of visiting someone in the same street and had mistaken the house in his drunken state. Mr. Benson observed that it was the most extraordinary case. However, as nothing was known against the prisoner by the police, he should discharge him with a caution to keep sober for the future. A drunkenness had got him into this trouble. And that brings us neatly to the end of the episode. Those footsteps upstairs suggest someone is still roaming about. Hopefully they'll find the right bed on their travels. If you'd like more cases like this, the rare, the baffling, and the historical unruly, we'd love to welcome you over on Patreon, where we keep all our longer, stranger, archival explorations. A quick like and a subscribe here would also help the channel tremendously. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, currently training a wayward typewriter, reorganising a cupboard that refuses to stay organised, and conducting ongoing diplomatic negotiations with an over-ambitious houseplant. Thanks ever so much for watching, and we'll meet again next time.